Welcome to The Political Animals, a show where two political philosophers, one a right-wing radical, the other a left-wing heretic, come together to discuss the social, political and cultural issues of our day. I'm Jonathan Cole, one of those philosophers, and the other is Holly Lawford-Smith. Holly, how do we find you today?
We find me well, but experiencing slight FOMO because the more redeeming trial is happening, and I have made it there for the first 2 days, and now I've got actual work I have to do. So I'm like, what's happening? What exciting, juicy things am I missing while I'm doing my proper job?
So
There's
some
like
people,
counting this, by the way, as a proper job, which is kind of funny.
some people sit back, relax and watch Netflix, but you're at a trial. That's your kind of relaxation, I gather. Your hobby.
It's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting.
I'm sure it is, and we might have occasion to discuss that in the future, but we actually have our own juicy topic for this episode, and we're going to pose the question, is LGBTIQ a political ideology? It's difficult to know where to begin, and I'm going to make you decide, Holly, and ask you, where do we start?
Yeah, I was thinking a helpful place to start would be in this distinction. If it's not an ideology, then it is what? Uh, and the thing that it could be otherwise, I guess, is just a protected trait, or a sort of a trait that obviously it would be hard to be all of the LGBTQIA plus at once, but it could be that this is an acronym referring to people with specific protected traits like sexual orientation, and that it's not an ideology because it is just a reference to those protected traits that are useful for anti-discrimination law, for example. So why don't I try to put the case to you that it is only this thing and therefore not also an ideology, and then maybe we could kind of go into why that might be insufficient. Does that sound?
Sounds great.
Um, yeah, so I guess like obvious, clear trait that some of the LGBTQIA plus have in common would be the LGB, right? So they have in common minority sexual orientation, which is same-sex attraction, whether exclusive same-sex attraction for lesbian and gay people, or non-exclusive same-sex attraction for bisexual people. And lots of countries, alas not all, but lots of countries have law, anti-discrimination law, equal opportunity law, that protects people from being discriminated against in things like housing or employment or whatever on the basis of this minority sexual orientation. Move along a little to the T, and then, okay, so that's transgender. Again, a little harder in this case to tell what the protected attribute is, and I probably have more thoughts on this because it's been an area that I've been working in, but let's just say for now, that is to have the protected attribute of a minority gender identity slash expression slash something. Okay, I don't know exactly how to tell that because I know too many of the objections, but just for whatever reason, maybe that was to be a person who identifies as the opposite sex. It now is a kind of conceptual mess, but at least there's a thing. Being transgender, there's some protected attribute. Nobody knows what Q is, except for that Q at least has come to be a kind of mandatory inclusion expression of being LGBTQIA+. So it might be that Q is, it just means the same as L or G or B or T, or I, which I haven't got to yet. Some people use it like a bit more broadly, and I think then at the risk of sounding non-academic, it can just mean like having a fun haircut or being polyamorous or thinking of yourself as different and interesting in some way when you're not. So, okay, some questions about the Q and whether it really could be
I
told.
thought you were hard on the T, man. I didn't realize you were
The Q comes
such a
under.
badass on the Q.
Yeah, the T and the Q both get some asterisks in this story, but the LGB are in the clear, and then the I is also in the clear. So clear protected attribute there of having intersex status or a difference of sexual development, very kind of like disjunctive category, some of which are sort of more and less dramatic in terms of what the differences are, but again, it's a kind of minority type of sexual development which might give you different like genital configuration or a different kind of like health situation. And again, an attribute that we would reasonably think should be protected from discrimination. It might need certain sorts of legal accommodations, like there's some activists that maybe want like a different marker on the birth certificate or formal documents or whatever. So, okay, so there's the case. There are these minority groups, at least LGB and I, and maybe transsexuals, like the old version of understanding the T. And they all have had a history of being stigmatized, discriminated against in certain ways. They need protections. So all the LGBTQIA+ acronym is doing is like gathering them together into a sort of loose coalition or alliance, and making sure that they're protected in these social contexts where they need to be protected.
That totally makes sense as a kind of demographic description in the first instance, because one of the questions I had was, is LGBTIQ something you are by default a member of because of certain attributes you have, or is it something you voluntarily enter if it has a kind of mission and purpose? And I think there is a distinction that can be made there, but it's kind of blurry because there are LGBTIQ or some combination of those letters, lobby groups, activist groups, support organizations, and the like. So if it's just a kind of descriptor of a segment of the population, then I guess everyone who has the attributes, whatever they think of the conglomeration, is captured in a part of it that could be used for statistical purposes. And you just outlined actually, the best case for this, even in a political sense, in terms of a need for protections, or there was a historic fight for rights that I think everyone can acknowledge. But here's where I think it starts to get interesting, because I'm an S, so I'm not part of this community either by default or by choice. And my experience was, obviously the people with these attributes have existed in society as long as we can tell. Well, I guess the Q one is probably,
You might be new.
I think non-binary is part of Q, and that seems to have come out of nowhere. But let's park that to the side for a second.
Yeah.
My experience kind of socially was it felt like we went from one day to the next and suddenly this acronym appeared and was adopted really rapidly and widely.
Yeah.
And one question I have before I even get to making my case that it is an ideology in some very specific and perhaps nuanced senses, and this perhaps I'll turn this into a question, Holly, is the very creation of this acronym and this community a political act, even if it's just a political act of a recognition that there are common interests, whether it's protection against discrimination, and thus if we pool all of our resources together, we have a greater mass and we have a greater voice and therefore have a greater chance of getting the rights. Or perhaps it's more a case of LG, which I guess are the kind of primary, more historical ones, widening the tent to bring in other groups that they recognize face the same kind of challenges. But in a way, the conglomeration is not self-evident, right? And you just outlined this, like T and I, for example, are something quite distinct. Yes, the sort of marginalization, persecution, rights issue, that's common there, but then you could say that about Black people or Indigenous people or even women, dare I say it, going back historically. So some kind of conscious act, it seems to me, and I don't know the history, was made at some point to coin this acronym and to sort of disseminate it. And I think it has been adopted by the state, clearly by corporations, and it's kind of the language we all use now. That's why we can actually pose the question and everyone listening or watching knows exactly what we're talking about. So, I mean, could you construe the very creation of the acronym and the constituency and its dissemination and its use, often by politicians and activists, as a political act?
I mean, I think the answer to that is just undoubtedly yes. And I mean, again, I know have to resist the temptation to make every anecdote here about the more redeeming trial, but like it did come up throughout the trial yesterday that like there were these comments by various women about, and then the lawyers for pseudo's side would always say the LGBTQIA plus community, or whichever version of that acronym, but they would never just say T. And really what's on the table, of course, of these feminists whose views are at issue in the trial is the T. It's only the T. That there's nothing to do with sexual orientation or intersex anywhere in those views. So there is some, like, it often, the way that that acronym is invoked is a political act because they want to position people as like the enemies of the rainbow community or whatever, or the enemies of one of our most like prominent and well-loved, happy, colorful minority groups. And so I think it is often political in that sense. I think maybe a more precise answer would require knowledge of the history of the, like, when, at what historical moment did the different letters get added or reorganized? And I don't know all of that. I know that there was a reshuffling where it used to start with G. And I know that the lesbians were kind of, and again, I don't even know why. So were they pushing for it, or was this, I think it had something to do with the like contributions that lesbians made to helping men with AIDS during the AIDS epidemic. But for whatever reason, there was a shift from it starting with a G to now it's starting with an L, and that has stayed there. So that can be a like, well, maybe there was always L, G, and B in the acronym, but the relative positions are reshuffled for political reasons or recognition reasons. I know that there was a lot of solidarity. For example, if you read, like, I think Leslie Feinberg's Stone Butch Blues book, which I can't remember exactly what year, maybe 50s or so, you see a lot of like solidarity between transsexuals at the time, cross-dressers, transvestites, that whole community, and the gay community. Like, they're hanging out in the same bars, they're suffering police raids together, they may be getting sexually assaulted in prison when they're imprisoned after those raids. So there is like a lot of sense of community between stigmatized people, even though the traits are quite different, right? Like having variant gender expression relative to your sex is quite different to having variant sexual orientation relative to what's typical for your sex. So that's like some of the bits of the story, but I think to really give a perfect tale of like, how did we get to this point where it seems like a good idea to add intersex in? Like, what does that have to do with? Okay, then what is Q up to? Like, what is going on there? Like, yeah, there's a story to tell there about how all that happened. But I think that story is probably going to be political, right? Like, it's good for our social movement to be expansionist because it's good to have more members. It gives you more lobbying power. It lets you like present yourself in a certain way that's palatable to the public. This like the rainbow community phrase that I mentioned already. So yeah, I can't really see how you would argue that it's not, given that it is already sort of an alliance of groups with quite different interests, where it's not easy to tell a story about what sort of treatment they really have in common.
And the very fact that there is contestation and conflict between the letters inside the acronym.
Which is little known, by the way. I mean,
Oh,
by
yeah.
probably in our circles it's known, but I don't think the
Yeah.
general public has any sense that there is like a like campaign to get the LGB to move away from the rest, or a drop the T, or a get the L out. Like these kind of campaigns, I
Yeah.
don't think normal
Yeah.
people realize that.
And that kind of speaks to some political dimension to this, right? It's not a
Yes.
naturally forming community in that it has to be defined, and there's some kind of conscious activity
Yep.
and some dissension internally about whether these are really these attributes can really constitute one coherent constituency.
Yes.
But just to your point, and this is interesting, I think the success of the dissemination of the term means for all of those in society who are S, which I guess is more or less the rest of society, they've now been sold on this term, right? And so they view it as one community.
Right.
And they've adopted this language, and it's become such a big part of our political rhetoric. And you're right, in complete ignorance of the sort of concern inside the family. And so
Yes.
it's kind of that is again, it speaks to the success which, and by success I guess I'm kind of suggesting this was all conscious and intentional. I'm sure there was some consciousness and intention in introducing the phrase. Someone had to first come up with LGBT whatever follows and started using it, or perhaps advised government to start using it, or however it happened. But that social phenomenon of everyone embracing this as part of the language, every single organization, and those organizations that don't are kind of consciously in opposition to it. Do you know what I mean? So there are actually opponents or people concerned, I guess, because of whatever reason. That social phenomenon to me is kind of amazing. It happens so quickly. I mean, it couldn't have been more than 10, 15 years ago, if I'm remembering correctly, in terms of
Yeah,
its
I guess it's tricky because
social
it's
embrace.
longer, right? And so then maybe the LGBT was around, I don't know,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
whatever the Canadian one is, that's just like 20 letters long. Like, yes, I guess those things can be quite rapid. And then you can signal your progressiveness by having an ever longer one. Like
Mhm.
now some of them have two A's or whatever. Okay, the asexuals and the
Two spirit.
agnostics or something.
There are
Just
two spirit
yeah, right.
sexuality
So
in there.
you can always show that you're ahead of the curve because you're not just saying LGBTQIA plus, you're saying AA plus or AA2S. Yeah, adding in whatever is the new stuff. Yeah, um, this is not really a natural segue, but but that's just thinking like maybe one thing that's like a helpful place to start in getting from the protected attribute sense to the like ideology and what is the ideology sense is like often when groups are stigmatized or just face social injustice, they're going to kind of come up with a sense of what they need, right? And that can be more or less organic. So let's just say the gay men were doing that. Or lesbians were doing that, or at a certain point, these two groups doing that separately. Again, I don't know how and when they came together. I know that in the feminist literature from the second wave, there's like resistance to that. Like gay men's issues are so different to lesbians, and gay men tend to be misogynists, and that's a problem for lesbian feminists. So there's a whole debate already there in the early days. Um, but yeah, you might just think like, yeah, homophobia is unified enough as a phenomenon that it makes sense for these two groups to fight against it. And that might still then be ideology in the neutral sense, right? It's not pejorative, but there's a set of ideas about what problems people with minority sexual orientations face and what it would take for them to be equal to the S, like the straights, the dominant members of society in the relevant respect. And again, I'm not even sure, or maybe it'll be interesting to hear if you think, because one question is like, is that set of ideas already creating problems? Like that is ideology, but it's just kind of equality ideology. I think the thing that people have a lot of problems with today is like when you go past that sense of like equality ideology, and this comes up not just for the LGBTQIA+, but also probably with critical race theory, with gender identity ideology. It's when the ideology of a subgroup uh, goes wild. Like it comes out with these really like wild or extravagant or excessive claims about what their human rights consist in, or what equality looks like, or what their liberation project should be, and that starts to alienate other members who have the protected attribute, and it goes well past like non-discrimination and kind of equal basic rights. So yeah, are we sort of on the same page that like merely a group having a sense of like that it faces injustice and a diagnosis of that injustice and a political project to end it would be ideology, but not in the sense that we're concerned with? Or okay.
Yeah, I think that equality piece, I don't think I would describe it as an ideology per se, but it
Okay.
is probably an expression of an ideology.
Yeah.
And one of the difficult things here is that my actual answer to this is that the LGBTIQ in itself is probably not a political ideology, strictly speaking. And if it is, it's quite a narrow, interest-based one. However, it's clearly been embraced by full-fledged political ideologies, especially progressivism and social democracy on the left. And it
Wait, you have to, because I don't know what you're meaning now by political ideology. You're using that to mean like full comprehensive political theory?
yeah.
Or so-
So what I mean is, like, let's say a progressive ideology for whom the key issues are social justice, equality, a redistributionist kind of economy, and sort of democratic participation and fairness and all
You
this
don't
kind of
think
stuff.
you wouldn't use the word to describe like feminism in the way I think about it. You wouldn't call that a political ideology because it's not comprehensive politics for the whole society. I think
I think,
I'm flagging that
yeah,
we seem to be
yeah,
using the word in quite different ways, and I'm
yeah,
really just using ideology to mean like a set of ideas,
yeah,
often with a unifying
yeah,
principle.
yeah. Well, let me clarify, because I can make a distinction that actually integrates with what you're talking about. So what I'm really hinting at is we could talk about broader and more narrow political ideologies in
Yeah.
your sort of neutral descriptive sense, such. But my point is that those broader political ideologies have embraced and incorporated the LGBTIQ cause,
Yes.
however conceived, as one of the expressions or concerns that they have within their ideology. But clearly, the kind of progressives or even social democrats, say in the ALP these days, who have really embraced the LGBTIQ, including its symbolism, its celebration, concern for the community, and clearly they campaigned in favour of same-sex marriage and the like. But they will also have a story to tell on racial justice, on Australian history in the Australian context, and reconciliation with Indigenous people. And so what I'm saying is that the LGBTIQ issue, however it's articulated and digested, it's kind of packaged into a larger ideological perspective. It's one cause amongst another that are now linked. And you could have the question about linking the LGBTIQ to Indigenous matters and all that kind of stuff.
But isn't the question for us, I think, is going to be more what is the content of the LGBTQIA plus ideology or set of ideas such that it is then taken up and incorporated by these larger, more comprehensive political ideologies or theories or whatever, or movements. Because again, I think it's going to matter a lot if it's just equal rights and like not getting subject to homophobia or not getting mistreatment as intersex or whatever, that is far less objectionable. Like if most, or again, I don't know, then we have to argue about equality of opportunity versus outcome or whatever, but maybe like our leftist parties, just contradict last week entirely, our leftist parties tend to take up like equal rights for everyone in the LGBTQIA plus coalition, and they mean that as like equality of outcome, but the more conservative, okay, well, you can tell that story as well. But for me, the real problem is like, it's not that these things have been taken up if they only mean equality, rights to like non-discrimination and so on. The problem is taking up gender identity ideology in the belief that your self-identification determines your legal sex. Like, so there's all these like absolutely wild claims that are kind of the tenets of these ideologies. And it's interesting because I mean, I guess the TQ together have these wild claims. Maybe that in certain points of the gay rights movement, they've sort of flirted with these kinds of claims. Like, for example, the debate over whether sexual orientation is fully socially constructed, whether compulsory heterosexuality explains why so many people are straight. Like, so there have been big ideas. And it might just be like if I knew more about the history again of each of the groups, I could tell you about the wildest period in their history where the theorist has really come up with some strange ideas about what that group is like or what its liberation consists in. But the one I know the most about at the moment, and the one I think we all hear the most about it, is the trans one. So really then the question is like, well, when the like Victorian liberals take up LGBTQIA plus as a cause, and they constantly like invoke it as like the rainbow community and the suicide rates in the rainbow community, blah, blah, blah. That's actually more how New Zealand talks than Australia, but whatever. It's all pointing to the same stuff. Do they mean it's your sense of self, that your subjective sense of identity is what determines your legal sex? And that just goes so far beyond, or like a male with a personality is entitled to the use of all and any female-only spaces, and a male who identifies as a lesbian is a lesbian. Like, that's the problem, right? Not the equality stuff.
And you're right. Actually, it made me realize that, we could possibly talk about ideologies within the LGBTIQ, and those ideological differences may even explain the friction and tension between the groups. And you can think of a couple of good examples. And I was thinking as you're speaking, this concept of heteronormativity, which is not in the first instance to do with equal rights, it seems to me. And you could argue that at least has ideological common connotations. And there do seem, I'm not an expert in this, but I gather from reading very reliable newspapers and blogs that there's at least some group of activists or academics in the LGBTIQ group, or maybe even straight allies, who have identified this thing called heteronormativity and seem to have an agenda of kind of breaking it down. And then on the T side, of course, it's interesting because in order to, I suppose from their perspective, they might say, in order to realize our rights, we need all of these pretty radical social changes, including changing the customary definitions of man and woman. Right. An interesting thing, and I think this explains the widespread acceptance of gays and lesbians versus the trans, which I think has a lot more uncertainty in the population. Certainly when I talk to people in private, I hear a lot more concerns about the trans movement than you would get from the public discourse, because they feel constrained. But the gays and lesbians aren't a challenge to the definition of man and woman, right? The whole notion of being gay and lesbian kind of assumes the same fundamental binary that straight people work with. That is, there's men and women have different kind of biology, and there's a different definition, and you're either attracted to the opposite sex or the same sex. It seems to both work from a similar foundation, whereas the trans community has challenged that very notion and changed it in terms of identity, such that you do have now biological males who apparently are lesbians in theory, or at least according to them. And so I suppose when we look beneath the surface, there are ideological differences, and I think at least the T in this group, and I would say the Q too, in terms of the whole non-binary, and so you can be something other than male and female, or you could be sort of fluid and sort of oscillating between the two, kind of pose a more fundamental challenge to the traditional social order of relationships and identities, if you like, in a way that the gay and lesbian communities, I don't think, have. And that's probably, I gather that's part of your opposition.
Yeah, but then I wonder if it's like just that the lesbian and gay theorists and thinkers didn't have as successful a challenge to the like conceptual order, or whatever you want to call it. Because as I mentioned, like there were people trying to say like, actually, probably everyone is bisexual. Like we just have this thing, socialization into heterosexuality, and a lot of people just kind of go along with it. So that there were, of course, that's not quite shifting the concepts of man and woman, but it is really shifting how we think about sexuality and sexual orientation. Like if we're all pansexual or whatever, or we're all bisexual, that's quite different to how people had been thinking of themselves. It is quite a big shake up in who would end up having sex with who if we were all fully enlightened. So it might just be that like that moment has passed. So what we see now in 2024 is like, oh, you just have like a few 3% or whatever gay and lesbian people just getting on with it. They're just like, they're only atypical in that one respect.
Mm-hmm.
And all we had to change was like a little thing with marriage, and that, yeah, okay, that was a conceptual upheaval for some people of faith. And there was a question there about whether that was a conceptual upheaval that was needed to secure LGBT equality. But yeah, they weren't asking so much. Okay, at least that's true now. But then there's a question of like, why are these wild tea ideas getting so much uptake? And is it just like they're comparatively more compelling than the everyone's a bisexual type ideas were back at the time that they had some currency? Or is it like, no, we all find them ridiculous actually, but we've just got these entrenched norms now of like, yeah, deferring to the most marginalized and believing, believe women, believe nothing about us without us. Like, so there's all these like mechanisms we have now that make it really, really hard to say to a person who's vulnerable, like, oh, you're wrong about that. So then how do you tell a man who thinks he's a lesbian, listen, I have all the compassion in the world for you and I want you to have your rights, but your rights are limited to people not refusing to hire you because you think you're a lesbian. But they do not make you a lesbian and entitle you to accessing the lesbian-only speed dating event. And so maybe it's just it's not that we give uptake to these new ideas because they are stupid. It's just that we now lack the tools to know how to say no to people who claim to be marginalized. And that's the real problem.
And actually, on that point, Holly, like this question of why, as a society, we can't say no to that, and when people do say no, whether it's lesbians or anyone else, there's real risk. You can be taken to court and the like, and that again makes me want to make an argument that this is a political ideology, because both the kind of censoriousness and the effort to silence dissent and to control the language and the debate is quite a political act. But one point that I really thought about a lot and just wanted to throw on the table at some point, and this is as good a place as any, is, and I'd be very interested to know what you think about this. It seems to me that the LGBTIQ cause, it's hard to know what noun to use after the acronym, but the cause, if I can call it that, it seems to me has been embraced and incorporated into what I would call the state ideology.
Yes.
Right down to the rainbow flag, its symbolism, it's like flown in public places. We have kind of days of celebration, and public servants wear their lanyards with the rainbow flag, and politicians love affirming and sort of telling people how much they care for the LGBTIQ community. And it seems to be wrapped up into a larger package, I would say, of diversity, equity and inclusion and social justice. And if you want to know what the state ideology is, you just look at primary school, because that's where we're all inculcated, I might say, indoctrinated into the state ideology. And at public schools, you'll see LGBTIQ paraphernalia and symbolism. And, I remember my son was taught very early, right at preschool, sort of randomly, in a way that, like the woman sort of caring for them made a real point of educating them that men can marry men and women can marry women. Now, of course, they're going to find that out anyway, and it's like not a big deal, but it just struck me as interesting that at 4, that was something that the teacher thought was really important that these kids know. And I kind of wonder whether there was a bit of fear that the parents might be a bit wobbly on that topic from her perspective. But in any case, the point
but can I ask you your intuitions about that case? Like, because mine are, let me just ask you yours and we see if they're the same. But like, do you feel differently about the classroom that tells the 5-year-olds some people are gay? Might even be you, like one day, or whatever it tells, and that's fine. And the classroom that tells, hey kids, like, it's time to start discovering your gender identity. Here's a picture of a spectrum running from Barbie to G.I. Joe or whatever. giving you all these like masculinity, femininity contents, like, oh, better start finding yourself, like whatever. So whatever it is that they're doing to tell children that like some people are gay and that's fine versus like some people are trans and that's fine, do you find those two things equally like indicators of the state ideology, or in the sense that there would be something to object to?
Look, I think kids are going to discover some of this stuff naturally in the playground. So
Yeah.
my son is in year 6. He goes to a public school. I can't remember when it was, but before long he would mention that kid X is gay and kid B is bisexual. So is they're
At
kind of,
what age is that?
well, pretty young. So I
Oh,
did wonder with the bisexual whether it had come from a parent, because I'm
yes.
thinking, but still, I mean, they're starting, like he had a girlfriend recently and broke up because he didn't talk to her, which is all they do at the age of 12. So that they are starting to,
Yes.
just in the very early stages of discovering their sexuality, I guess. But I guess it's kind of reported to me as a kind of unremarkable thing that clearly there are gay people in the world. I mean, this is interesting, Holly, like from a very young age, like maybe 6 or 7, he would see a trans woman on TV and say, that's a man.
Yeah.
Just in an innocent kid like thing,
Yeah.
could tell and found it curious that
Yeah.
they were
What
just like
what's
a.
that guy doing? Yeah.
So I think sometimes parents, we love to impose ideology and stuff because we're so fearful of, particularly on the left, of like bigotry, or if you're on the right, being infected by enlightened views or whatever, that, progressive. There's this kind of mutual fear and anxiety. I do think so. I think on the one hand, it can be fine and innocent in a kind of descriptive sense, but it can also be highly ideological. And I do have a friend, I happened to catch up with him yesterday for lunch. Shout out to John if you're listening. He does listen to the podcast, and he is a lawyer who does a lot of cases around the transgender issue with, parents, often conservative Christian parents whose kids are being transitioned against their will.
Yeah.
And they're like, and he said, he told me once, you can really notice when there's a teacher who really sort of has an agenda of driving the trans thing, suddenly you can get an explosion of
Absolutely.
gender dysphoria. And it does make you ask that chicken and egg question. And my own brother, I hope he doesn't mind because he listens too. I've got to start getting anecdotes from people who don't listen. But, his daughter came back from school one day and asked if he was a boy, asked if she was a boy.
Yeah.
And he was like, what? And it turns out that this concept had been introduced in the class.
Right.
And so she was innocently asking the question because, like, kids trust adults. So when an adult says, look, you might not be a boy or a girl, that obviously they start asking a question that they may not have otherwise asked. So
That's why for me, the two cases look so different. Because it just doesn't seem to be the same, like, there doesn't seem to be the same suggestibility to me for gender stuff than there is for sexual orientation stuff. And there doesn't seem to be the same stuff at stake. So for me, it's like, okay, what are they trying to do? Why they're introducing to kids that it's like some people are gay and that's completely fine. They're trying to eliminate a history where gay people had these private, isolating, especially boys, I think, like just realizing they had these feelings that were different from all their peers and that were highly stigmatized. There's like a lot of trauma in gay youth, like psychological trauma in like realizing that you're different, realizing that people hate the way that you're different and trying to come to terms with that. So I can really sort of see, even if I might want to like hear out the case for like, listen, they're going to come to that stuff naturally, and so long as they know their family, maybe it doesn't belong in schools. Okay, I'm open to having that conversation, but the direct kind of harm reduction plan to me, it just looks much more justifiable. Like if the messaging is just some small number of people are gay and that's completely fine, like, and if that ends up being you, we're all completely fine with it. Okay. The gender stuff, because I don't know, like, sorry, I'm saying this all in a messy order, but it's like, even if you had a highly suggestible kid who was like, oh, some people are gay, maybe I'm gay, like, I want to be special, I want to be like, then what? They turn 15, 16, they hook up a little with the person of the same sex, they find it gross, and then they stop. So it's like, what's at stake? What's the worst that can happen? And sexual orientation is such a rigid thing, especially for boys, maybe like some evidence less so for girls. Those experimentations, they're going to correct themselves. So it's not like you're just going to have someone, like a little boy that the teacher suggested he might be gay and then he's gay forever. Like it's just not how it works. Then with trans stuff, it's just like, because the whole stuff is just such a conceptual mess. If they merely meant something like, hey, listen, 0.0000013% of people have the strong sense of being trapped in the wrong physical body, unlikely that's going to be you because it's so fucking rare. But if it's you, that's fine. But that's not the message, right? The message is extremely confusing. Like, here's what even gender is, and you might be a boy. What's a boy? I'm not going to tell you. Like, and then all the kids thinking they might prefer the company of the opposite sex, or they might have some personality trait that's better characterized by our current norms as belonging to the other. There's just so much more confusion. And then the question is, what are the harms at stake there? Oh my God, like they're dramatically worse than merely experimenting a little bit, hooking up with someone of the same sex. They are like, I get on puberty blockers, I socially transition, I'm on a pathway to lifetime medical dependency, infertility, loss of sexual function, like all the complications that can come along with having taken puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. So for me, it's like the case for that it's ideology for the teacher in the primary school to be like, hey guys, maybe you're trans. This is like so much stronger of a case against that. And even just in numbers terms, because the real sort of trans people, the percentage is so low that the chance of there being someone like that who's like having a secret internal crisis like there was with gay kids, it's just like so much less likely, and therefore the policy interventions are so much less justified.
Yeah, so there's a massive difference between the consequences and implications.
Yeah.
And you're right that it's not just the letter T or L or G. It's the what you have to accept underpinning that.
Yeah.
And it really does strike me that I think the reason the L and the G and the B have, I would argue, met with pretty widespread acceptance. And I think even just in our generation, Holly, a lot of people have changed their views on this. It's quite a historic shift. And that's because what they have to change in their worldview is relatively limited. It's like, okay, so some percentage of the population, for whatever reason, just nature, is attracted to the same sex. Okay, a bit of a contestation around marriage, but that's kind of a discrete debate, and it does have some implications for the clash of religious freedom and other rights in faith-based schools, which is a pretty unique Australian thing because we have like so much of our education is outsourced to the churches. But with the T, and I would argue the Q, acceptance demands some really radical shifts in your whole conception of reality, of the world, of nature. And that's what makes it ideologically significant, excuse me, but also so contested. And this is why I come back to this point about the state ideology. When the state embraces this as an ideology, perhaps wittingly or unwittingly on the part of the various actors, bureaucrats and politicians, it has real consequences, because then it becomes official teaching in school. They set the policy on transgender care and speech laws and discrimination and the like. And that, I think, is a big part of why we're in the mess we're in terms of this socially contentious, difficult situation. And it's why, as a libertarian, I would prefer these matters were left to individuals. So, for example, just to be clear, I object to the state embracing LGBTIQ as part of its state ideology, because I don't like state ideology. It's not personal about the LGBT, the L, the G, the B, even the T or the Q. I just think these matters should be left to individuals. But see, I'd have no objection to the formation of an LGBTIQ party. If someone wanted to form that party and people would vote for it, that's just a voluntary association. People can use the acronym, they can change the acronym. It's just once the state gets involved, we all fund the state and it represents all of us. And so when it takes a position on a kind of contentious issue as part of its ideology, it creates problems, in my view.
But I think the question is whether it's contentious. And sorry if this is like a little repetitive, but I do think that like the heart of the philosophical question is whether this is just what equality requires for a marginalized social group. And I mean the T in particular. Yes, the acronym is used, but we're really all only talking about the T at this point. Is it just equality or is it something much more? And for me, it's only objectionable, like we violate state neutrality, liberal neutrality, only when you go beyond what is required for the equality of citizens and into these much more like contested and controversial sets of ideas. So, for me, it's not quite settled yet whether it's just equality or more, because the question is like, again, just like from the outside, I can't quite see why we couldn't just protect trans people as trans from non-discrimination. And that would be equality in the same terms as everybody else. So the question is, what gets us to this further thing that to protect trans people, you must treat them as the sex they identify with? That's the further thing. And I want to call that, and I think all gender critical people want to call that, the controversial ideology that is then violating liberal neutrality when the state takes it up and forces it on everyone. But maybe they would say, literally what it is to be trans, like, is to be a person of one sex who identifies so strongly with the other sex or category or whatever, that the only way to have a like flourishing, happy life is to be categorized along with the ones you identify with. So what equality consists in for us is inclusion or accommodation in the opposite category. And the more forcefully they can make that argument, then the more like, well, the state is just doing what it did, securing women's rights and the rights of people of color. And I just think partly probably because the trans activists are not speaking directly with their opponents, it's very hard to get to the heart of that issue. I tend to have a view on that issue, but I think it is like not quite yet resolved.
But this goes to a really interesting question about the legitimate role of the state, because I'm with you on the, if you like, the negative liberty case to protect trans people from discrimination. I'm 1,000% in favor of that. You should suffer nothing adverse in terms of employment, access to services, and the like, just because you identify as the other sex, irrespective of what society thinks of that. But here it feels often that at least trans activists want to invoke what Mises called the social apparatus of coercion and compulsion, that is the state, to force a certain view or to silence people from having a view on the definition of a male and a female, for example. And it seems to me, I find it somewhat bewildering, the lack of understanding of just how radical a shift this is and the level of intolerance for people who are not willing to abandon thousands of years of tradition and our current science on biology. Because if you talk to a lot of biologists who aren't necessarily kind of even crazy gender critical feminists, they say, well, the kind of, there isn't the scientific basis, at least in the sense we understand science, for this view. And my point is, I don't understand why both activists on the one hand and the state on the other can't, on issues where there's room for reasonable disagreement and conscientious objection, just allow a kind of open field. Like, can the citizen demand of the state to make everyone conform and accept their identity when it goes in the face?
Could they, like, I think I'm trying to understand whether you are objecting to social apparatus of coercion and control being used to secure equality per se. Like, would you object to it in the case of African Americans in the US or women in Australia?
It's not so much equality. It's and I wasn't very clear, so apologies. But it's more I'm thinking more of the cases where people get cancelled, and they're often cancelled by being taken to human rights tribunals, or there's some government
But they're
bureaucratic
cancelled for
involvement
violation
because they
of,
say
of
because
cult.
they yeah, like for misgendering or refusing or just uttering the offensive line that I don't think a man can truly become a woman. I can recognize that some people feel that they're a woman and they take measures to transition, but I'm still going to make a distinction between
Yeah, but what I'm trying
like,
to push, like what
yeah.
I'm trying to push you on is that like I think you're not taking seriously enough the possibility that that is what trans equality requires.
Oh yeah, yeah. No,
So
I understand that.
if the gender critical feminists like me going out and saying, oh, a man who thinks he's a lesbian, like that's my locution for one of these men, and then I get dragged before the human rights tribunal or whatever, and they say I'm violating the dignity, the equal dignity of this man. That it's not like, and again, I'm arguing the side that I like I'm not on
Yeah,
against you, which is it's a good
I
reversal.
don't understand. It's a good
But I
question.
do want you to take that seriously, like that it's his
Yeah.
literally his equality. And then do you object to the state using its coercion and control to enforce the equality of persons, especially when there have been marginalized social group dynamics in the history?
If yes, if that's the definition of equality, which is why it's such a tactically useful term, because if you, depending how you define equality, it makes it very difficult to criticize it because it's got intrinsically positive connotations. But if equality means the whole of society needs to change these 10 fundamental ideas about human nature, science, the definition of a man and a
But it
woman,
did
of
for
sexuality.
racial equality and for women's equality. It did. We had to make huge shifts in how we thought about a lot of things.
I
And I
know,
think state power can. So I'm just trying to. Are you
yeah, yeah.
disagreeing that state power can be used for those projects? Because I think it can.
Well, I see. I guess what I'm saying is, well, my objection is to the idea that a citizen can demand that the whole of society change the very way it talks about an issue in order for the sake of equality, when I think the equality can be dealt with very concrete rights and the like. And I'm all in favour of there being avenues for redress when discrimination happens. And the difference, I would say, between, say, the equality of men and women and racial equality is on the facts. That is, I don't think there is a basis for reasonable disagreement
But you
on any
only know
scientific
that now.
ground.
You only know that now. And I'm just
No,
trying
I
to,
know, I know,
I'm just
I know.
fighting the transactivist side, right, for the sake of argument. You know that now looking back, but you could not have known that at the time. And there were many men at the time, like vociferously arguing for the like irrationality or inferiority of women.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking I wouldn't defend at the time that they should be allowed to say all those things. I'm using the benefit of hindsight to say, like, no, those two groups actually were equal, and it's an appropriate use of the state's power to enforce the equality of citizens. So the really hard question for us now is, what's the future going to be when it comes to this trans stuff, and how are we going to look back and judge whether that coercive power was used rightly or wrongly?
Was this precisely why T is in the LGBTIQ, is it not? Because it then invites you to draw an
Yes.
analogy
Yes.
with the lesbian, gay, bisexual rights
Struggle. Agreed.
struggle. And I totally understand. This is why I think it's almost a losing argument, because it's too nuanced and difficult. And of course, in the current environment, you just get written off as a
Yep.
bigot before you hear it. But let me come at this at another angle. And I know you're just like, you're actually playing devil's advocate from the
I
trans
know. Yeah.
side, which is good. But you're okay. So you're a gender critical feminist. I imagine you would object to misogynistic speech and certain views, women are inferior because of physical differences or whatever, or whatever. But is your instinct, or is indeed your kind of policy, to use the social apparatus of compulsion and coercion that is the state to make it illegal for any man anywhere to even hint that men and women might be different in some way? Or is that just something to be worked out, including by you in terms of argument and and the like. See, because that's the kind of parallel to what I'm trying to get at. And for the record, this is the irony. So I am happy to use the pronouns for a transgender person that they identify with. I don't think a man can become a woman truly, and vice versa. But you know what? If that's the way you identify, I'm happy to, for the sake of charity, use that. What I object to is this idea that I'm no longer allowed to utter that view or I can be cancelled, which just seems childish, totally counterproductive, and totally against even the liberal view of a free society.
Yeah.
And let's actually have dialogue. You make your argument, I have my argument. If we can't even talk about the issue because you use the state to control the view we can have, then it just makes us stupid because we're robbed of the opportunity to do the debate. And I would just love it if there was a bit more recognition of what a radical shift is being demanded here. People need time to actually have the discussion, don't they?
No, I
And it would
agree
be
with
nice if
that.
you tried to convince me
Yes.
that actually you're wrong on the way gender works. I'm open to that argument. But instead, and I can tell you now, well, you don't need to be told, but so many people are intimidated into silence. And so the public debate does not reflect at all accurately where the public sentiment is, because there's enormous fear around this topic. And that also, I think, is going to be counterproductive in the long run for the T community, because it means people are just secretly talking about this issue behind the scenes. And so what you get is not acceptance, but conformity.
No, I agree, but I just think that the difference is that like these debates had to be openly discussed and played out at the time where they were live issues. So I'm going to have different intuitions about whether I now think that people should be permitted to engage in like very hateful speech about racial inequality or very misogynistic speech about women's like irrationality or whatever. But I think the argument is there on your side, regardless of what I would say about my instincts to like have hate speech laws or whatever, use the power of the government to suppress views on those issues, because the trans issue literally is playing out for the first time now. And I think there's like a lot of public confusion about that because transsexualism is an older issue. And so some of the like leftists familiar with this issue and lots of the feminists, they can sort of have the feeling that this all happened in the 60s and like, why are we still arguing about it? Well, we're precisely arguing about it because there's a whole new thing going on with like self-identity alone, the non-binary phenomenon, this stuff that's really like just seems to be mixing in mere gender expression and like dress sense into this idea that you have this protected attribute of being transgender. There's just such a like different thing going on that all of that does need to be like played out and argued for and established. But again, maybe in 40 years, like if that happens in the next 5 years, is established, like trans equality really requires believing these claims, then I might think 40 years down the line, it's appropriate to have hate speech laws enforced by the government that prevent people saying a man who thinks he's a lesbian. Like maybe that's how things are going to turn out. Fuck, I hope not. Because I'll be like, whatever, doing a lot of community service at that point.
Ollie, this we have to wrap this up. I think my conclusion, it's interesting having this conversation. It's, I'll admit, way more complex than I actually thought when we sort of first posed that question. And I would say it's not clearly ideological in any straightforward traditional sense, LGBTIQ, but clearly there are ideological dimensions, and
Yeah.
really, I would say unambiguously, there are political ramifications
Yep.
from the conglomeration of these terms and what they each mean for society, education, the state, and the like. That's my kind of summary. What do you want to share? A kind of a final thought on the topic?
No, I think I've said more than enough.
Well, that allows us to come in on time. Thanks for that, Holly, always in service of the show. Thank you, Holly, for the conversation. Thanks to everyone watching and listening. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe on YouTube, like the video, follow on podcast platforms, whatever you call them. Give us a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify if you listen there. That's all from me. Holly, would you like to say goodbye?
See you for episode 3.